If you're going through something right now that feels really overwhelming, whether that is something like grief, the death of a loved one, or financial instability, perhaps it's something like a redundancy or sudden loss of work, a recent medical diagnosis, or a legal case, whatever it is that is making you feel so overwhelmed, if you're at the point where you're just like, I really cannot do this on my own, like I've exhausted my own strength, if you're at that point, then this episode is 100% for you. Please allow me the time to take you out of your own situation and show you how God is capable of helping you out of that situation that really seems impossible. I'm going to be using a story from the Bible. It's one of the most extraordinary stories in the Bible, but it's so underrated. People almost forget to talk about this. This is the story of Jehoshaphat. He's a king. He's the king of Judah, which is one of the tribes of Israel, and he's at a point where he's been ambushed by 3 different armies. And bear with me, I know that you're probably not being ambushed by 3 different armies. I'm aware. This is the exact reason why I've chosen the story, because it's probably not like yours right now, and that's strategic. First of all, I want to bring you out of your own head. I want to bring you out of your own situation and just get you to see how God has dealt with an extreme situation in the past. And by the way, this is not a one-off. So further down the line in the episode, I will actually show you other stories very briefly of when God has done the same. And it's really helping us understand the pattern of God and God's personality and character and the things that we need to do to get answers. So back to Jehoshaphat. He is at this point where he's being faced by 3 different armies. There is no reason why he should win this battle because they are completely outnumbered. And then on top of that, this battle is really personal too. So this battle is being fought by the Ammonites, the Moabites, and then the Edomites. So the Ammonites and Moabites, they are direct descendants of Lot. Lot is Abraham's nephew. Abraham is the father of the Israelites. The Israelites come from Jacob. So that's the Moabites and the Ammonites. They're really family as far as descendants go. They are family. They're from just the lineage next to them. And then even worse, the Edomites. The Edomites are Esau's descendants. They come from Esau, who is the twin brother, literally the twin brother of Jacob. And Jacob is where the Israelites come from. So Judah is one of the tribes of Israel, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, because Jacob was renamed Israel and then he had 12 sons, and then all the different tribes had the names of his sons. So I say this just to say how personal this battle was. Judah was not just facing any odd army, they were facing family. They all came together to kill them. And when Judah got this report, they were like 30 miles or so out. So it's not like, oh, we can deal with this or we can call people to help us. He was in a situation where he realized that him and all of his people, the children, the men, the women, all of Judah was about to be wiped out. All of Israel was about to be wiped out. And he as a king did not know what to do. So that might be similar to your situation right now where you're just like, I do not know what to do. And not even just I don't know what to do. The thing that I know to do, I know is not going to work. I can't fight this. I don't have the resources, you might be thinking. I don't have the resources to fight this. I don't have the strength, the emotional capacity. I don't have the people. I don't have whatever it is you are needing right now. You just do not have it to fight this. There is no logical way that you can explain how you are going to win this battle. And on top of that, you're at the point where the battle is facing you. This story is in 2 Chronicles 20. I say all this just to give you a bit of a background, and I've divided this episode into 5 parts so that you can skip to the part that you want. But I'm going to tell you what those parts are in case you want to listen to everything from the beginning to the end, because if you're in this situation, quite frankly, all of those 5 parts are really useful. Part 1 is really the situation. So this is where I give you context. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail than I have already. In my brain, when I'm reading any story or like just trying to find parallels with my story, I like to really know what the background is. I don't really like to take things out of context because a lot of people do that and it's fine. A lot of people will kind of look at a story in the Bible and just say, this is what God said in that moment. But if you don't fully understand the backdrop of it or the context of it, yes, you'll benefit from that scripture, but you may actually miss what God is telling you in particular. There might be some parallels, like some really close parallels to your own situation, and you may miss that. Part 2 is Jehoshaphat's prayer. So nobody watching this video should miss this. Part 2 is essentially what Jehoshaphat prayed. In 2 Chronicles 20, it's only 6 verses, verse 6 to verse 12. But there are themes in that prayer. It's very easy to kind of look at that prayer and think, oh, he prayed this. But there are themes in that prayer, and I've broken it down into 5 themes. And I really want to share that with you because God doesn't just answer prayers immediately. He doesn't do that for every single situation. And God did in this situation as he was praying. God gave an answer. And literally the next day, God followed through. So the next day, God won the battle for them. God literally fought this battle for them. It's very rare that God will do that. So he must have said some things in the prayer to invoke God. And I've sat with it and I have looked at it and I've prayed with it, and I've just kind of extracted 5 themes from that short prayer that I would like to share with you. So if you're in this situation right now where you're just like, I'm not sure if I can do this, this is super important because these are the themes that you want to pray. I almost consider it the blueprint. If you want God to answer you right now, there's a blueprint. And Jehoshaphat gave us that. So that's part 2. Definitely don't miss that. Part 3 is kind of linked, but it's specifically how God answered. God answered in 2 ways. He did answer whilst Jehoshaphat was praying, but then, like I said, the next day, God fought the battle for them. But there is a way that God fought it. If somebody says to you, God fought a battle, you're going to be like, did he come down and fight it? Like how did God fight that battle? So I'm going to break down exactly how God did it. And I really feel like that's super important because it's also really useful to know how God is able to win situations for you when you don't have to do anything. Because one of the things God literally said to them when he was answering the prayer, in the process of the prayer, he said, you do not need to fight this battle. This battle is mine. Girl, listen, the way that those words just cut deep into me. You know, when God is like, sit this one out, I've got this. Yeah. And it's so important to understand how he actually does it. How did he actually do it? If you're praying to God, especially if you're praying a kind of blueprint prayer, you want to know how he might answer it, you know, how he might do it. It helps your brain. Our brains are just so limited in comparison to God. His ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts, right? Like we're humans. It's inbuilt. We're flawed. It's really good to understand how God has done that for other people in the past. Number 4 is the wider pattern. So I'm going to touch on this briefly because essentially just letting you know that this is not an isolated incident. So the whole idea of God only did it then, but why would he do it in my situation? He will. He's done it lots of times before, in different ways, mind you, but he has done it lots of times before. So that will be part 4, which is the wider pattern. Part 5 is 5 things that you need to remember. And this is super important for you if you're watching this and thinking, oh my goodness, my situation is really overwhelming. These are 5 things that you need to remember in your situation right now. They're also kind of like 5 themes, but 5 really important things that I want you to step out of the Jehoshaphat story, step right back into your story and remember for your situation right now. I know I said 5 parts, but part 6, I'm actually not going to include in the video. So in this podcast episode, I'm going to put part 6 in the written part. So I'm going to do a blog post, okay, a written post. I'm going to put the link in the show notes if you're listening on a podcast platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. But if you're watching on YouTube, I will put it in the description box. Part 6 is essentially going to go into more detail. For example, when the pattern breaks. So when is it that God will not answer? Not that he wouldn't answer, but God may not always fight your battles. He may empower you to do the fighting. So for example, if you think about David and Goliath, God did not go and fight Goliath for David. He actually got David to fight the battle, and God empowered David with his stone and sling. And then also just going into more detail with the exact blueprint, I'll put that in a table for you. So if you're someone who's a visual person, you can literally see like the themes and the prayer that Jehoshaphat prayed in a table, so you can know exactly exactly how to apply it to yours. I'll give examples as well in that table of exactly how you would like pray your own prayer and put yourself in that situation using his blueprint. I'll also go into more detail about the particular lineage of Jehoshaphat. So how he comes from Abraham and how that links through to Jacob and then to Judah, who is Joseph's generation, and then to David. This is particularly a good reason to read the written post, because you're able to see how you are not in isolation yourself. So we only know ourselves. We only know our own generation. And sometimes we don't realize that we're part of God's big thing that he's planned. And there were people before us that were also carrying this promise and this plan. And sometimes it's really hard to kind of see yourself as part. You just see yourself in isolation. So it really kind of puts it all into perspective and gets you thinking about, okay, maybe God does know the plans he has towards me, and he's already made these plans, and I'm just kind of acting it out. So actually, he is fighting for me already. He's made room. He's put resources in place. He's put people in place. But anyway, that's for the written post, okay? We're already 10 minutes in and we're still on the intro. Again, the reason why I've broken all of this down is because if you want to skip, you can skip. If you want to go to the bits that are super important for you, you can totally do that. If not, then the entire episode is about to begin. So get your notes, get your teas, get whatever you need, and let's hop right into Jehoshaphat's story. So I'm going to start with the situation. This is the situation. Let me set the scene for you. Jehoshaphat is the current king of Judah, but he is not just any king. He comes from the line of David. If you know anything about David, God literally said he is a man after my own heart. But David also was not just any king. He comes from the line of Jacob, the line of Judah through Jacob. And of course, Jacob is Isaac's son, and he has a twin. Jacob has a twin, Esau, and Isaac has a father, Abraham. So actually what we're going to do is we're going to go to Abraham and we're going to start. Abraham is about 18 generations, if I've counted right, 18 or 19 generations from Jehoshaphat. So we are going far back. But Abraham was separated from his family. God told him to move out of a land where he was. So 18 generations ago, God asked Abraham to move out of a land, move away from family, and he said he was going to direct him into a land. So he directed him into Canaan, and God made promises to Abraham that he will give him all of this land. All of his descendants would be many and they would be blessed. But also around that time, Abraham was separated from Lot. Lot was his nephew. Lot chose to go to Sodom and Gomorrah. I think that's what happened. And then Abraham was separated. So Abraham started this entire journey of creating a new bloodline that God himself had chosen. He started it alone. Now, when Abraham got to Canaan, Abraham did not own anything at all. He ended up being a nomad. He was living in tents and he was living with this promise that God had made him. But up until when he passed away, he didn't even see the land that God had promised, right? He was blessed, but he didn't see that land that God had promised. But God made that promise to Abraham. And he also told Abraham a lot of things that would happen. He told Abraham that his descendants would go to a land, which was Egypt, and they would actually end up being enslaved and God will bring them out of that land. So he sort of said a lot of things to Abraham that eventually ended up happening. So let's move on from Abraham to the next generation, which was Isaac. Abraham had Isaac when Abraham was 100 years old. He had other children, but God was like, you know what? I'm bringing my own chosen one into this world. He literally said that to Abraham, and Abraham laughed, and Abraham was like, God, I'm 100. My wife is 99, Sarah, and she didn't have any children at the time. But Abraham had children with, another woman, and he said that child will take the blessing. And God said, no. I'm bringing my own child into this world, and by this time next year, that's what God said, by this time next year. And Abraham was like, okay, sure. And he laughed at God because he didn't believe it. But by that time next year, Isaac was born. So Isaac was God's very own chosen son of Abraham to carry this line, this promise onwards. Isaac then eventually has Jacob and Esau. And this is where it gets really interesting, y'all. Jacob and Esau were born to Rebekah, and there was the whole story behind it, but I'm not going to go into that. But whilst Rebecca was pregnant, she said it felt like a war in her belly. She sought God, and God was like, that's because both of them are going to be two warring nations, but the older will serve the younger. Now, this is where it gets really, really, really personal with Jehoshaphat further down the line. Esau was the older twin and Jacob was the younger twin. So God is saying that he has chosen the younger twin, Jacob, to carry on the promise that he had made to Abraham and of course to Isaac. And now he's passing that on to Jacob, but he's not passing it on to Esau. Now, there were a few different things that happened between Jacob and Esau in their lifetime. There's the story of the birthright being stolen. Jacob ended up being a little bit deceptive. He bought Esau's birthright for a pot of stew. And all of this is kind of important, but I would go into it in a different episode. I've decided I'm going to make a different episode about how jealousy can really run through a bloodline. And in today's day, in your actual life, you may not understand how much of jealousy that's been weaved into an entire DNA for generations that you're fighting. You might actually just think, oh, they hate us. No, it's in the bloodline, okay? But that's a different episode. Anyway, Jacob and Esau, through their lives, they were warring a little bit. And then eventually Jacob ends up kind of stealing Isaac's blessing. Not even kind of, he literally did. Esau's blessing. He goes to his father, pretends to be his brother. Mind you, this is already in the will of God because God already chose Jacob, but he deceived his father, essentially. In any case, Jacob, who we're now talking about, is the very beginning of the Israelites. Jacob is the one that has 12 sons. So up until this point, everyone's living in Canaan. They're still immigrants in that land. God has promised it to them, but nothing has happened. And we're already like 3-4 generations in. So there is, again, a lot of jealousy between the sons of Jacob. So he has 12 sons, and then he has Joseph, whom he loves so very much. And his brothers get jealous. Again, think about the jealousy that's happened in previous episodes, in previous generations. So anyway, they get very jealous of him because clearly God had chosen him in a way. But when Joseph was 17, God had shown him in his dreams that the sun and the moon will bow down to him and all these different things, right? So his brothers get really jealous and they pretty much plan to kill him. So they throw him into a pit and they plan to kill him. But eventually they're like, oh, you know what? Let's just sell him on because, they could make money from him instead of just killing him. They were like, let's just sell him on to Egypt. Again, they're doing this out of jealousy, right? They are thinking, we're just going to sell him to Egypt. We're going to tell our father that he died. And this is their father's favorite son, like absolute favorite son, because he's the youngest and he was born, in his old age. But also because God chose him, In any case, they sell him on to Egypt, not knowing that this is literally part of God's plan. God had already told Abraham that he will move them out of Canaan to a land, and then further down the line, they will be slaves. So anyway, they go to Egypt. I'm not going to go into that story here, but through being in Egypt, through the betrayal of his brothers, Joseph goes to Egypt, and then 13 years later, after being a slave, he just kind of rises up. He becomes second in command in Egypt. And all of this is just God's plan, God's plan, God's plan. So he gets there and there's famine in Canaan, right? There's famine everywhere. And so God brings them out of Canaan and he brings them to Egypt to beg for food. Now, again, that's a different podcast episode, but essentially God eventually moves all of Jacob's family. He moves them into Egypt because that's where their brother is. That's where the food is. They would have died in Canaan. And so he moves them there. To cut the long story short, God then moves them back 400 years later. So by the way, he multiplies them in Egypt. And that was God's plan all along. 70 people, he moves them into Egypt. He multiplies them. He makes them abundant and they're plenty, which was part of the promise that God made to Abraham. Your descendants will be plenty like the sand of the earth. I think God said that. But anyway, there's so many of them. And then the Egyptians become really jealous again, and they enslave them because they think that they'll take over Egypt. So God uses Moses to bring them out. This is the entire Exodus. I know that it seems like a lot, but bear with me because it shows how intentional God is. And this, the story is about the Israelites, but girl, you've got here somehow. So God has also been intentional about you. You may not know the entire story because nobody sat down and no one sat down and wrote my own, I don't know who my great grandfather is or whoever, but we are part of this Abraham plan. We are part of, Jesus has come and allowed us to be part of that. In any case, God moves them back to Canaan, out of Egypt. The whole Moses parting the Red Sea, God parting it through Moses, let my people go, Pharaoh. And God does that. Now he moves them back to Canaan, but they still don't fully own Canaan. And Abraham to Joseph was about, I believe, 4 generations. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So 4 generations. Abraham all the way to David is 14 generations, I believe. And it is only when David becomes king that the fullness of that promise that God made to Abraham actually comes to pass. David in his kingship secures everything. He really takes over Canaan. He secures all of the land that God had promised them. A lot of things happened obviously in between Moses, Joshua, but during David's reign, that is when God's plan comes to pass. 14 generations later, baby girl, 14. God is not slow. He's just intentional. Because through all of that, he already showed his power and might. It wasn't just that he took them out just to bring them back. He displayed his glory. He pretty much showed his dominance and the fact that he is God. And this is so important because when we get to the next part where you're actually praying the prayer, using the blueprint that Jehoshaphat uses, it's so important to mention how powerful God is, how much his power is at stake, because it's so important to God to show who he is through the journey of his people. In any case, David does his thing. Man after God's heart. One of my favorite characters in the Bible. Amazing. From David to Jehoshaphat is only 5 generations. So all in all, from Abraham right down to Jehoshaphat is 18 generations. And this is important because Jehoshaphat is still very much a part of God's plan. Now let's talk about the Edomites and Ammonites and Moabites who are coming to fight this war, because we're in 2 Chronicles 20. Now through all of this, by the way, God has kept them separate. God gave them land. God gave Esau his land. The same way that God allowed the Israelites to take over Canaan. The same way God drove everyone out of Canaan and he was like, this is the land I'm giving you, and he got them to conquer it through all of those 14 generations. The same way he did that for the nation of Israel, he did the same for Edom. Now, something really interesting is that when the birthright story, Isaac, when he was blessing his 2 children, he actually said to Esau, who is the older brother, when he came back and he was like, okay, father, I'm ready for my blessing, da-da-da. And the father's like, hang on, I already blessed, because Isaac was blind. He was like, I already blessed. I thought I blessed you already. And he was like, no, that wasn't me. I wasn't here. And obviously Jacob had stolen the blessing. Isaac's blessing to Esau was something along the lines of, you will serve your brother, but when this yoke is heavy, you will break it off your neck. So essentially, Esau lived this life where he was just always in struggle with Jacob. Jacob and Esau actually in real life ended up making up, but their descendants just ended up being in such struggle with each other. They would fight, they would win, they would fight, they would win. It kind of felt like this breaking of the yoke off the neck when they get tired and restless, just like the blessing said. At this point, with Jehoshaphat, 19 generations or 18 generations after Abraham, the Edomites were really at war. They really hated the Israelites. They really did. So even during the Exodus, they wouldn't even let them pass their land. But you know what's so interesting is that even though God allowed the Exodus to happen, God saved the Israelites, God literally let them take over Canaan and everything else, God actually gave a blessing. He showed mercy to the Edomites and the Ammonites. He was like, do not fight them, do not conquer them, do not take over. So God, through the Israelites, had already shown mercy to these people. And you will see that in the prayer of Jehoshaphat when he's like, God, hello, we showed these guys mercy. You said we should show these guys mercy, and now they're coming to fight us. But anyway, that is the background, okay? Just to clarify, the Ammonites, the Moabites, Edomites, they were coming to fight Judah. And Jehoshaphat is the king of Judah. Now, the Ammonites and the Moabites, they are from Lot's family. So I'm just going to briefly touch on Lot, because Lot is the nephew of Abraham. So when God kind of did the separation thing with Abraham, Lot went a separate way, Abraham went a separate way. And then eventually Sodom and Gomorrah were completely destroyed. But then Lot and his two daughters escaped into a cave. And in that situation, the daughters felt like there was no more of them, like there was nobody left. And so what happened, because remember Lot's wife looked back, so she died, right? She turned into salt. And what actually happened was that the daughters felt like they were going to be extinct. So they made their father drunk and they slept with him. And that's how the whole descendant started. They literally slept with their own father to make children. That is how their entire bloodline restarted. Isn't that crazy? That's the Ammonites and the Moabites. The Edomites, their bloodline came from Esau. So you can see that they were distant relatives of the Israelites, but they were all family. They were all family. Traced back to Abraham, they were all family, yet they had this deep hatred. And I think one of the reasons for that is because of the way that God had chosen Israel and blessed Israel. You notice that although he gave the other guys blessings, it just wasn't the same. When God has chosen you and singled you out for something, there are people on the sideline watching from generation to generation to generation, and that jealousy is in their DNA. It goes from being like personal jealousy to, as a family, this is our tradition. And then suddenly, as a nation, these are our rules. It really just kind of sips its way into the system. And before you know it, you have enemies and you don't even realize that it came from a pot of stew, or it came from my wife turned into a pillar of salt and you got all this blessing. Like, you just forget. Nobody knows because people have died. So that is the situation we're facing. That is the story. And you can imagine in that moment, Jehoshaphat's thinking, this is my family. These are blood. This is personal. But it wasn't just personal to him. It was also personal to God, because of the way that God had shown them mercy, and God had honored the fact that they were family to Abraham, because God was really close with Abraham. He called Abraham his friend. So God literally showed them mercy, and they were turning around now and trying to fight God's chosen people. So I say all that to say that is the situation. And I know that your situation might be different. And thank you for allowing me to take you into another world and actually just be distracted from your own situation for a moment. But the fact remains that in that moment, Jehoshaphat was completely overwhelmed. The Bible actually says that he was terrified. You know, some versions say that he was alarmed, and in that moment he just didn't know what to do. Imagine this king of Judah, that God's chosen people, and he's like, where are we going with this? Like, I have no idea what to do next, you know? And in today's world, in your situation, I know I've really felt that way before, where I'm just like, I don't know where I'm going. Like, I have been on my knees in fear, looking at God and just going, if I die, I die, because if you're not doing anything about this, like, I don't really know where to go with this. I cannot win by my own strength. Like, I need you. So if that's where you are, the next part would be absolutely amazing for you, because the next part is where I explain the prayer of Jehoshaphat in that moment and the 5 different themes that you can take away and how you can apply that to your own situation. So this is part 2, where I talk about the prayer that Jehoshaphat prayed. This is the blueprint. Now, I want you to really understand how you can apply this into your situation, okay? So I'm going to go through breaking down the prayer. But before we even get to the prayer, let me just tell you exactly what happened, because this theme overall is actually very useful. First, when Jehoshaphat heard the news, you know, he was afraid, he was terrified, he was overwhelmed. Like, he's like, what are we doing? But immediately he made up his mind. This is so important in 2 Chronicles 20, when he says he made up his mind that he was taking this to God. He decided within himself that he's taking this to God. And then what he did was he proclaimed a fast, because this was going to happen. This battle was going to happen tomorrow. So he proclaimed a fast. All of Judah, he was like, we are fasting. And although that might seem like, why would someone do that? Let me tell you what fasting does, because it took me a while to understand fasting. You know, when you think about food fills you up, it makes you comfortable, it makes you feel like, I'm good. But when you are like, God is so much more important to me than food. Food is what sustains you. Food is what keeps you energized. Food is what gives you the energy you need to keep going, right? And you're like, no, I'm abstaining abstaining from that. I'm going to get my fill from God. I'm going to deny my flesh the ability to hold itself together using the energy from food, and I'm going to feed myself by tuning into God. That is what fasting does. And so he doesn't do this because it's like it's the thing to do. It's not always the thing to do, but in this situation, that was what he did. And he doesn't do it alone. He proclaims it. He's like, all of us, we are all fasting, all of Judah. Then he does something else which is so awesome. Like, it just shows you the kind of king he is. He gathers everyone together, not just the men, not just the army. He gathers the men, the women, and their children. He gathers all of Judah, his entire nation. He gathers them together. And this was where he said this prayer. So this is the backdrop of this prayer. This is a king that is not trying to be like, oh, I've got this sorted, or I'm going to talk about this with my officials. He gathers his whole people. He humbles himself before his own people. And he's letting his people know that I don't got this. We are all together as a nation. We are taking this to God. Kind of like he tears down his own pride in front of everyone. It's such an act of worship. Like when you are like, I'm not trying to fight this battle. I'm not trying to be strong because, the world that we live in right now just wants everyone to feel like they've got this. It's like, no. Show that vulnerability because there are situations where you don't got this, sis. And until you show that, God is not going to step in. Now let's get into the blueprint because it's so amazing. It's so amazing. I've got my laptop in front of me. So if you're watching the video, I'm going to be looking down a little bit. So this is the prayer that Jehoshaphat prays, but I'm going to break it down into the themes. There are 5 themes altogether that I've picked out from this prayer, thinking about how you can apply this to yourself. If you're listening to this podcast episode, don't worry about writing it down. I'm going to put all the themes in the written version of the of the pod. I'm so excited. I really am. I've been holding this in my spirit since yesterday, so I'm just so excited to get it out because I really feel like God just wants someone to hear this. And I remember when I was on my knees, on my face, my head between my knees, and I was just spent in my spirit. I had no emotional capacity. I had nothing left. The way that I humbled myself before God, not even knowing if God was going to come through. And I remember hearing this particular woman just speaking so boldly about her situation, and that it wasn't a podcast, it was actually a preaching, and it changed my life. And I almost feel like I'm in that situation right now, just having come out the other end, knowing how God shows himself. And I just wish that I understood this blueprint, but I certainly will be using it from now on. The first theme is to remind God who he is. So when Jehoshaphat was praying this prayer, these were his words: Lord, the God of our ancestors. The way he even addresses God, he's not saying my father, he's not saying, because it's not just even about him. He's like, Lord, the God of our ancestors. He's talking about Abraham. If you listen to part 1, you know what I mean. He's talking about Abraham. He's talking about the God of Isaac. He's talking about the God of Jacob. He's talking about the God of Judah, but Joseph. He's talking about the God of David. He's like the God of our ancestors. And at this point, he's praying this prayer out loud. He's not even just saying him alone. He's saying the whole of Judah, literally the whole nation. So this is how he starts. Lord, the God of our ancestors, are you not the God who is in heaven? Hey, God. Are you not? He's asking him a question. He's not challenging God. He's like, are you not the God who is in heaven? And then he goes, you rule over the kingdoms of the nations. Power and might are in your hands. And no one can withstand you. So when he's talking about you rule over the kingdoms and the nations, he's not just talking about Judah. He's talking about the Ammonites. He's talking about the Edomites. He's talking about the Moabites. He's talking about every kingdom and every nation. In this little bit alone, Jehoshaphat is telling God who he is. He's reminding God, and he's not saying this with pride, because remember, he's humbling himself as king. He's humbling himself in front of all these people. He's not saying this with pride like, God, are you not this? He's reminding God, even almost to stabilize himself, almost to be like, I'm reminding myself who you are out loud. Because at this point, he is spent. He's like, God, Lord God of our ancestors. Are you not the God who is in heaven? Oh my goodness. Oh, I've prayed this prayer, this particular bit before. Honestly, there's something it does to you. Even in that moment, you're like, at this point, It's all you. It's all you. And he's not informing God of anything God doesn't already know. He's not telling God something that's new to God. He's just using it as a way to say, this is the God that I'm speaking to. As a way to kind of, distance himself, but more like really acknowledge that God is the one that holds the power and might. It's not arrogance at all. It's faith. It's faith. I suppose the other way to look at it is he's not even saying, I'm not coming to you wondering if you can help. He's saying, I'm coming to you because I know you can help. By even saying you are the God of our ancestors, he's also acknowledging what God has done for their ancestors, the Exodus, for example, and everything that he did with, David and Goliath and all of that. He's really acknowledging what God has done for his ancestors. Okay, so number one, the theme in your prayer is remind God who he is. For your own prayer, you can start by speaking out loud who God is. Take on that, put my pride to the side. Like, don't go, God, you said this, No, you don't need to. First of all, God already knows what you're going through. Second of all, he's already planned for this thing that you're in. This situation that you're in is personal to God. It's personal to God. And I'll explain why it's personal to God later, but it's personal to God. He already has plans for you. There's something inside of you that he needs to come out. And if this situation crumbles you, that's not even going to happen. If the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Edomites had killed all of Judah that day, all of God's plans would have died. Do you understand that? They would have wiped out God's chosen people. And by the way, this is the same line that Jesus came from. Oh my God. This is the same line that Jesus came from. If you follow what I mean here, like God had a plan overall, but we're just seeing it play out in human form. The first theme is that you need to remind God who he is and just anchor that to yourself. Whatever you know about your family, like whatever you know about your father, the God of your father, whatever it is that you know, talk about what he's done for you before. Just start speaking it out loud. Theme number 2, recall what God has already done in the past. So this is what Jehoshaphat prays next. He says, our God, did you not drive out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel and give it forever to the descendants of Abraham, your friend? The fact that he added Abraham, your friend. So what Jehoshaphat does is he goes back to history. Remember, he's 19 or 18 generations away from Abraham. So he reaches back into history and he's reminding God what God has done. From Abraham, who was a nomad, to the promise he made to Abraham, to Egypt, taking them into Egypt. If you listen to part 1, you'll know what I mean now. Taking them out of Egypt, the Exodus, save my people, let my people go, the whole Moses thing, right? Taking them into Canaan, and then David, in that one line alone, he is reminding God what God has done already. So first he's saying to God, are you not the God in heaven? He's saying you are the King of Kings. You are the Lord of Lords. You are the one with the most power and the most might. And then he's giving God examples. He's saying, hello, I know that you've done more than this before. That is what he's saying. Okay. So when you are thinking about your situation, call out what God has done in your life. Call out what God has done. I do that sometimes, even without fully thinking about a theme of prayer. When I'm in situations where I'm just like, this is a lot, I remind myself out loud who God is. Ancestry is one thing, but think about your own life. There's been times where God has worked miracles. Come on. You could not see a way out, and then suddenly someone calls you out of the blue and they're like, can I send you some money? Or you get a job, or you get healed from that sickness. Listen, girl, I have some examples. I've had times when I've literally felt like I was about to die. Twice in my life, I really felt like it was going to be the end. And I listen, oh God, one day I will share. But let me tell you, by reminding yourself, your spirit, by the way, by reminding your spirit and by reminding God what he has done before, you are invoking the same power. If you genuinely don't have any examples where you can say God has worked in my life, if you genuinely don't have that, remind him what he's done for other people. Remind him what he's done here. As you listen to this podcast and you see how God moves, remind him that he is still the same God of Jehoshaphat. He's still the same God of David, a kid who killed killed a whole giant with a sling. He is still the same God of Isaac and Jacob and of Abraham. He is still that God, the same God yesterday, today, and forever. Everything in the Bible literally applies to you because you're part of that lineage. Everything in the Bible still applies to you. If you genuinely don't have anything, but I promise you, if you looked hard enough, you will find something that God has done in your life. But if you really can't, just look at this entire story. Remind God that he is the same God that fought for Jehoshaphat and Judah. Remind him who he is. Works every time. I love the fact that Jehoshaphat was like, Abraham, your friend. It's like, I know what you've done in the past. All of that also shows how intentional God is from generation to generation. The whole story is mind-blowing. So that's number 2, recall. Theme 3 is state the injustice. It's hard sometimes to feel like injustice is being done to you because nowadays wars are not necessarily fought like they were in the good old days. In this situation, he is faced with a battle. People are armies are physically coming to fight him. That is a physical thing. It's like they will fight me, I will die, or they'll die, or whatever. Nowadays, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. I mean, to be fair, there weren't really wrestling against flesh and blood anyway, because of how far back he goes back, but that's another story for another day. But what I'm saying is that sometimes it's very difficult to call a thing what it is. Like the injustice that you're facing, it can be very difficult to name it, but it's so important for you to name it. I'm telling you right now, that is 50% of your battle won. It is so important for you to name it. And don't worry if you can't. Allow God to reveal to you what is happening, because nowadays people fight psychological warfares. Sometimes these people, you don't even know who they are, right? It's like, that person did this, but I'm not sure. Just call what you know. Whatever you know right now, call it out. So it might be that you're facing an illness, call that out. It might be that you're facing financial instability, call that out. It might be that you're facing, you're going through grief, call it out. It is injustice to you, because if that thing overwhelms you and completely takes over you, then you are not going to be able to do the work of God in your life, the very thing that God has called you to do. That thing is not only a distraction to you, it is a threat to God's work in your life. Therefore, it is injustice. Now, by calling it out, I'm not saying that you have to name someone. Just name the very thing that it is, the very threat that it is. And this is exactly what Jehoshaphat did. He called out the injustice, and this is how he did it. Jehoshaphat said, "See how they are repaying us by coming to drive us out of the possession that you gave us as an inheritance." So this is verse 11. All of this, by the way, is from 2 Chronicles 20. So this is verse 11, and he says, "See how they're repaying us by coming to drive us out of the possession that you gave us as an inheritance." So you know what's really interesting about this? He calls out the injustice, and this is where you have to really pay attention to the themes here. He calls out the injustice, but he doesn't just say, look at this bad thing that's happening to us. Look at these people trying to kill us. No, he says, see how they are repaying us. And by us, he also means God, you and us. Yeah? By coming to drive us from the possession you gave us. God, the possession that you, by literally saying that, he's saying they are coming to take the blessing that you gave us as an inheritance. So he's not just making it personal to Judah. In fact, he's not making it personal to Judah at all. He's making it personal to God. He's saying, see how they are threatening your plan. He's literally saying to God, can you see how these people are coming to move us out of the very thing that you promised us? Remember, this is all coming from, you are the God of our ancestors. You are the God that has done this and this and that before. And now he's saying the promise that you've made us that has come to pass, they are now coming to threaten your plan. This is what's so amazing about this prayer. It's a very short prayer, 6 verses, but the themes are so amazing. So don't make it just about yourself. Make it about God and God's plan for you. Anyone who threatens you is threatening God's plan. If it's a financial situation threatening you, it is threatening God's plan. Anything that's making you overwhelmed and taking up space in your mind, taking up emotional space, mental space, and making you feel really unsettled is a threat to God's plan, because you as a human being, you are flawed. You cannot function when all you're worried about is money. You cannot function when all you're worried about is a medical diagnosis. You cannot function when you're going through grief. God himself designed you that way. So by taking this to God and calling out the injustice, what you're saying is, hello, Dad, Father, God of my ancestors, this is a threat to your plan. And this is really important. So take it to God, not because he doesn't know, but because you're trying to make it about him. Theme 4, the fourth theme in Jehoshaphat's prayer, is that he then goes on to admit that he cannot do this on his own. It's the idea that you really need to admit surrender. And bear in mind, you're going to be praying this prayer probably in your own intimate space, maybe with your partner or on your own or whatever. You're not going to be praying it in front of nations, right? But this is a king that's supposed to have all the answers. And he's praying it in front of nations. He's really humbling himself before God. So even in your secret place, you need to be flat on your face. You need to be, because to be fair, at this point, if you're listening to this and this is resonating, considering I've been there before, girl, at this point, you don't have a choice anyway. You cannot do this on your own. So say it. Don't try and be strong. Don't try and make yourself this, I can get through. This is your God. And God is a girl dad. Baby girl, let me tell you, the way God has come through in my life, I know he's a girl dad. He understands what you're going through. Okay. He totally gets what you're going through, but there is something about you being able to surrender to him. You being able to say, this one, I cannot do it. This one is beyond me. This one, I'm going to just stay here until you tell me to go right or left. So this is exactly what Jehoshaphat prayed. This is verse 12a. He said, for we have no power to face this vast army that is attacking us. We do not know what to do. We do not know what to do. Imagine a king admitting in front of all the people he's supposed to be protecting. And he's like, we do not know what to do. There is something about, because God loves to be seen by you. Because remember who God is, right? He is this king, yes. He's all powerful, he's omnipresent and transcendent and all these wonderful things. But at the very core of God is love. And not just any kind of love, a love that is so biased to you. God has made it so that the moment you turn to him, the gates are just going to open. You don't have to do the moment you acknowledge God and you say, I cannot do this on my own, I need you. There is something about saying that to God that doesn't require, you don't have to go to a priest to ask for access. You don't have to write a letter. You can just turn to God and say, I need you. And he's like, I'm there. Because at the very core of him, he just wants you. He just wants you. He wants your heart. He wants you to turn to him. He wants you to acknowledge him. He wants you to understand that he's got this. So literally by saying something similar to Jehoshaphat, which is, I cannot do this on my own, you're in. You've already pulled on his heartstrings. He's like, okay, let's go and save that one. That's theme 4. So in your prayer, really bring it to God. Tell him literally, not because he doesn't know, but he wants to hear it. He wants to hear it. Just tell him literally, I cannot do this on my own. I'm outnumbered. Get on your knees, humble yourself and tell God you need him. Usually where your strength stops or where you say it stops is where God begins. If you have a plan B, you have people you can call, God is not going to move because he moves when it's obvious it's him, even to people that don't believe him. So if you're ever in a situation where it's beyond you, that is the perfect situation actually for God to move, because then other people can see it and they're like, oh, that girl has a God. I want to know who her God is. People know that that is God and he loves those situations. And then the final theme 5, is fix your eyes on God. So this is the final thing that Jehoshaphat says. And it's in verse 12b. He says, but our eyes are on you. So he goes from, for we have no power to face this vast army that is attacking us. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you. 6 words. Very simple. But our eyes are on you. This is exactly how Jehoshaphat ends his prayer. He doesn't end it by saying, God, go and kill them. He doesn't end it by asking God to do something. He doesn't even end it by demanding anything from God. He ends it by saying, but our eyes are on you. And what he's saying is, we've exhausted our strength and everything else, but we're looking to you now to move. We are looking to you to do something. This is arguably the strongest, most important thing you could say to God. To be able to say to God, but my eyes are on you. Even that but is so strong, because already you're coming from, you are the God of my ancestors. You're coming from, this is what you've done in the past. You're coming from, I cannot do this on my own. And you've laid out the injustice and everything else. And then you're like, but my eyes are on you. But you are the one I'm looking to. I don't want to get emotional because I'm sort of saying all of this with conviction as if it's a story that is so detached from me. But I've prayed this prayer. I've been on my knees where I've said to God, but my eyes are on you. Maybe not exactly that, but I've laid it down. I've laid it down and I've ended my prayer with, but God, you are the one I'm looking to now. Surrender is such an act of worship. It really is. To be able to lay it down before the King of Kings and lay it down at his feet and say, I'm not looking at the problem, I'm looking at you. I'm not looking at how this situation is so overwhelming. I'm not looking at how my bank account has nothing in it. I'm not looking at how my partner has left me. I'm not looking at how I am homeless. I'm not looking at how I'm going through grief right now. I'm not looking at how dark the clouds are. I am looking at you. You are literally telling God that he's bigger than your problems. You're not even asking. You are stamping your feet down in faith and saying, I acknowledge everything that's going on. I acknowledge who you are. I acknowledge the injustice. I acknowledge all of that. But my eyes are on you. This is the best form of worship you can bring to God. This is such a statement. This is such a statement to be able to make to God, to say, yeah, all of that's happening. Yeah, it looks like I'm drowning, but my eyes are on you. So when you are praying your prayer, say that. Say that. Put your eyes on God and really mean it too, and actually do it. Don't think about how big the problem is. Just think about how powerful God is. I remember listening to a podcast when I was going through a period where I was really, really afraid, and I really held on to every word that he said in this podcast. If I can find it, I will link it down below. But this guy really talks about it's hard because, you feel so overwhelmed by what is happening. It's a very difficult thing. And unless you've been in it, you're never going to really fully understand how overwhelming things can be, right? Especially when you just feel like your back is against the wall and you have no way out. But if you could just take your eyes off that situation and put your eyes on God and put your eyes on how powerful God is and just fix your gaze on him. And I remember holding on. I was driving at this point and I was holding on to every word. Almost my fear was so crippling and I was just holding on to what he said. And I remember writing it down and just thinking, fix your eyes on God, fix your eyes on God, fix your eyes on God. I had to almost repeat it out loud to myself before my spirit could move from fixing my eyes on the problem to fixing my eyes on God. So anyway, these are the 5 themes. So to remind you, this prayer goes from 2 Chronicles 20 verse 6 all the way to 12, all right? And these are the 5 themes in Jehoshaphat's prayer. Number 1 is remind God who he is. Number 2 is recall what God has already done in your life. Theme 3 is state the injustice. Call it out by name. Specifically state how it is a threat to God's plan in your life. Theme 4, admit that you cannot do this. Theme 5, last but certainly not least, fix your eyes on God and say that to him. So the next part is really going to be about how God responded to this prayer, because although we've broken it down in themes, this was a chunk of prayer that was prayed, and in the moment, God immediately answered this prayer. So I'm going to talk about how God responded to this prayer and what God ended up doing and how he essentially won the battle for them. The answer to the prayer was immediate, but then the battle was won the next day. So all in all, everything was won in less than 24 hours. And that's because of this prayer that was prayed, as well as other things like him humbling himself, calling for a fast and everything else. So let's head on over to part 3 to talk about how God answered Jehoshaphat. Welcome to part 3. We're going to talk about how God responds to this prayer. Jehoshaphat prays up until verse 12, and pretty much as soon as he finishes praying that prayer, verse 15 to 17 talks about what God did. Okay, so the Spirit of the Lord came upon a man called Jehoshaphat Hazael. Now you have to remember that before Jesus, so back in the day, people did not have the Spirit of God in them like we do now. They didn't have the Holy Spirit. So God will come, speak through them, and then he would go. So God's Spirit came upon this man, and this is what the man said. So this is what God said through him. So the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him. This guy is a Levite, by the way. So one of the tribes of Israel, and he's a descendant of Asaph, which is a completely different, I don't want to go into it, but yeah, important. And this is what God says. God says, do not be afraid. I'm just summarizing verse 15 to 17. Read it all for yourself. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army. So God also calls out the problem, and God is like, do not be afraid and do not be discouraged, because courage is quite an important thing to have. And fear is also quite an important thing to lose when God is fighting for you. Do not be afraid or discouraged of this vast army, for the battle is not yours. This is where God also claims the fact that this battle is now personal to him. He says, for the battle is not yours, but God. So God is saying, this is my fight. This is not your fight. This is my fight. God is acknowledging that actually this fight comes from back before you were even alive. This is not yours to fight. I will handle this. All my many decisions got us here. Like, I've got this. I am that God that you said I am. I've got this. Okay. And then God tells them, tomorrow march down against them. So God is saying, I'm going to fight this, but you still need to show up. Tomorrow march down against them. You will not have to fight this battle. When I first read these words, I just fell back in my chair. I was like, imagine God telling you, you will not need to fight this battle. Huh? Oh my goodness. You know how like in Psalm 46, is it Psalm 46 verse 10? Yeah. And God says, be still and know that I am God. Oh, girl, you will not have to fight this battle, he says. This is my battle, not yours, okay? But he continues to give them instructions. He's like, take up your position, stand firm, and see the deliverance of the Lord. And this is so important to me because, again, we're not fighting armies, but the idea that before you even see the result, I need you, God is saying, I need you to have courage. Do not be afraid. Have faith. This is the very definition of faith, which in itself is like one of the biggest acts of worship. I need you to show up there. This army that we know that by any human standard, you will be annihilated, not just you, but your entire descendants. All of Judah will die. All of God's promised people will literally die. And God is saying, I need you to show up. Just show up. And they didn't question. This is what I really love about this response that God gave them. God didn't say very much. He possessed this man. He came into this man and he said what he said, and that was it. And then the entire nation, Jehoshaphat and all the people, because remember, he's standing there with men, women, children, they start worshiping God. It's one of the reasons why I think that this entire scripture is so underrated. Like, we don't talk about it enough. Imagine God telling you you're about to win this battle. You're not going to need to fight it. As a human being, are you not going to be like, well, God, how is it going to happen then? Aren't you going to want to ask questions? And knowing that the Spirit of the Most High God is in the room, aren't you going to want to ask questions? Aren't you going to be like, well, how is it going to happen? What is your plan? I know that you're the God of my ancestors, but like, how? And are we going there with slings and stones like David did? Are we going there with like, you're going to want to ask God questions? But they didn't. They all started worshiping God. They just knew that answer that came so quickly, Jehoshaphat just had this faith about him. Again, remember, he's not just any king. He's a descendant of David. The way that David worshipped God, and the whole thing about Asaph, by the way, he was one of David's chief musicians. So the guy that God possessed, which I think is such an interesting thing to happen. The guy that the Spirit of the Lord entered, not possessed, the Spirit of the Lord entered to speak. He was one of the Levites. He was one of the descendants of Asaph, who was the chief musician. And the way that they just got into worship straight away. And not only that, the next day, when they literally went to fight this battle, Jehoshaphat sent all the worship people to the front, not to the side of them, not behind them singing God's praises. Jehoshaphat led the entire battle with praise. From the moment God told them that they're going to win, they didn't question and they started thanking God as if it had already happened. This is what is so mind-blowing, and this is what I love about the Bible, because you can read it as a text. text, or you can really let God take you in. Like, just let the spirit of the Most High God whisper to you. They started praising God like it had already happened. And not just that, imagine showing up to a battlefield. You're already outnumbered and you are sending people who are singing. Not people with bows and arrows, and I'm sure they didn't have guns, I don't know, but like not swords, They're sending musicians. Can you imagine? If you're Nigerian, do you know what shekere is? You're carrying your shekere and you're like, this is the day that the Lord has made. Girl, they were singing, and they weren't just singing any kind of song, by the way, because in verse 22 is very specific about what they sang. So this is so amazing. Okay, actually, was it verse 22? Let me just check if it's verse 22. Verse 21. So they were singing. After consulting the people, Jehoshaphat appointed men to sing to the Lord and to praise him for his splendor, for the splendor of his holiness as they went out. And they were saying these words exactly. Give thanks to the Lord, for his love endures forever. Imagine just repeating that. Give thanks to the Lord. They were thanking. They were in the mood of praise. They were singing. Some texts talk about how they're singing joyfully. Give thanks to the Lord for his love. They're calling on God's love. They're pulling on God's heartstrings. Do you know what I'm realizing? You know how people say maturing is understanding that? Girl, maturing is understanding that God has he definitely doesn't have weaknesses. Let's not put it that way. But there's some things that you can say to God that would just make he's biased to some things. His love is one of them, because that is the very definition of him. If all you do is remind God of his love for you. There's a chapter in the Bible that always gets me, Romans 8, where it talks about how God's love, like there's nothing that can separate us from God's love. Read Romans 8:31 all the way to 39, where he talks about no height, no depth, the present, the future, no angels, no demons, no sin, no guilt, no shame. There is nothing that can separate you from God's love. So imagine you are going in a battle and you are pulling on God's heartstrings by telling him that he is love, and you're thanking him. You're not even just telling him, you're thanking him for how his love has already saved you. Oh, this God, that is what he wants to hear. That is exactly what he wants to hear. So they are singing this, and then in verse 22, the unimaginable happens. This is how God actually fights the battle. In verse 22, it says, as they begin to sing and praise. It's not even like after they were singing or when they got to the battleground, because the battle is actually happening in this place called Tekoa. Is a desert. So they are coming up to the point where like they can overlook the desert. They're not quite there yet. And so all of these people are singing and praising God. The people that can't fight, by the way, they're all singing and praising God. And then as they come up, as they are singing, before they come up, as they begin to sing and praise, verse 22, the Lord sets ambushes against the men of Ammon and Moab and Mount Seir, the Edomites, who were invading Judah, and they were defeated. Now, I was reading this verse and I almost kind of like skipped it, but then it just dawned on me. How does God set ambushes? Like, how? Because you know what ambushes are? Like some texts actually say liars in wait. So it's like a surprise attack. So people are hiding in the bushes and then you don't know they're there. You think the battle is over there. So you're still going over there. Before you know it, like people come, like that's an ambush, right? So as they are singing and praising, they can't even see the battlefield yet, but they're singing and praising God in that moment. That is when God sets ambushes. So me in my mind, because I'm very curious, I'm really curious, not just about the Bible, but I'm so curious about God, and I'm so curious about us as human beings and our relationship with him. I really am. Now that I've seen God work in my life, I was like, how would God set an ambush? And I went down this rabbit hole. And to be honest, nobody fully knows. There are different translations of this. So if you look at different translation, it says things like God sets an ambush, God sets ambushes, God sets lies in wait, or whatever. But as far as we know, ambushes are people who lie in wait. Now, nobody knows exactly how this happened, because how would we know? We're not God. But some people talk about how like angels did that ambushing. And then other people talk about how actually, this is the version me I want to believe, yeah? That actually the Moabites, Edomites, and Ammonites, they were the ones who set the ambushes. But actually God confused them, because what we do know is that God actually did confuse them. God sent panic. And it says this like in the later verses. But I want to believe that they were the ones who set the ambushes. But then their own ambush ambushed them. And I want to believe that that is what actually caused the confusion. The reason why I want to believe that is because I've seen God do it in so many stories. Like if you think about the story of Esther and Haman, which we're going to talk about very briefly in the next part. Haman, he had this grand plan of how he was going to execute the Israelites or the Jews. His own story is what happened to him. God has this way of turning the exact thing that people have set to ambush you, to surprise attack you. God has this way of turning it against them at the very last minute. God just does that. He does it all the time. He does it, like that is one of the things that God does. So I really want to believe that God actually just turned whatever they planned for Judah, God actually turned it against them. But it's also possible that God actually had angels fight that battle. God has sent angels to fight battles before. What is so interesting is the fact that in the moment when they were praising and when they were singing, not when they arrived, because actually when they arrived at the battlefield, everybody was dead. Isn't that crazy? So God actually tells them, go to the battlefield, go and take your stand, go and stand your ground. So obviously they're going to be thinking, okay, we're going to stand. And their own plan was we're going to keep singing. But before they even got there, everyone was dead. And what actually happened is that, first of all, two of them turned against one. Remember, there are three armies. So two armies turned against one army. Then, after they killed everybody in that army, they now turned against each other. So they got really confused and they didn't know each other from it. So they all killed themselves. And one translation in the Bible says they helped kill each other. It's like they helped God kill each other. Isn't that crazy? God came and fought that battle for them just because they were singing and praising. So by the time Judah got there to the battleground, not only was everyone dead, God literally told them to come and take all their spoil. He didn't say that, but the reason why he'd got them there, because he didn't need them to fight. He didn't even need their presence to win the battle, but they got there and they ended up they had so much plunder. They had all these articles of value. Like people back in the day will take gold and all sorts, because that's the thing. Like you kill the army, you take all their spoils, so they would bring it to war. And so they got there and they just had lots of things to take. They had so much stuff to take that it took them 3 days to take all of that stuff. And then by the 4th day, they went back to praising God. And this dance of praise and worship, it's so interesting. It's just so interesting. This idea, I feel like in this part, this is what I want you to take away from that. Not only did God fight the battle for them, but they were able to kind of really pull on, I don't want to say God's heartstrings again. We don't really understand God fully, but they're able to kind of get into this mindset of thank you because it's already happened. They were already praising joyfully before they won the battle, before God won the battle, and they were praising in the morning the next day. So as soon as God told them what was going to happen, they started praising. The next day, they woke up, they put their action behind their faith, they went in their faith, and they continued praising God. And even after they took the spoil on day 4, they continued praising God. There was just this thing about praising God. And that's exactly how God won this battle. Judah did not need to fight. They did not need to do anything. And in today's day and age, and certainly in my life, I know there are battles that I've really felt like Psalm 46:10, the be still and know that I am God. There's some battles that God wants to fight for you. I know that this is not exactly the same situation as maybe what you're going through right now, but there's some battles that God actually wants to fight for you. God wants to prove to you that he is God. He loves the praise that you give him. He loves the worship that you give him. He loves the acknowledgement that you give him. And not just that, what happens after that? So in this situation, obviously we started off with Jehoshaphat was afraid and he was terrified, and then he went through all the different processes of we're going to fast, I'm going to put my pride down, I'm going to pray, we're going to thank God and all of that. And this fear that he started with now ended up being returned not just to the people, the Ammonites, Moabites, and whoever, but the surrounding nations. There is a way that God wants to move in your life that people around you would fear him. People around you would see what God has done and they will be so afraid. I mean, like these guys were so afraid that Jehoshaphat, for the rest of his reign, he had peace. That's how afraid people were of fighting him because of the God that he serves. Imagine that situation where you are under, and I don't know, you're in a legal battle, or like people are gathering against you, smear campaigning you, or whatever the case might be, and then suddenly God shows himself in such a way that they will be so afraid that you will have peace for the rest of your life. So your fear now becomes their fear, and your fear is replaced with peace. But in the process, God has shown himself to you, because that's a new thing you've learned about God. And he's also shown himself and his power to other people around you. That is how God likes to be loud about you. He doesn't play with his chosen ones. He absolutely doesn't. And if you're watching this, you are one of those. This is part 4, where we talk about the wider pattern and how this is not an isolated event. The idea of this is just to remind you that this is not a one-off, because, it's very easy to kind of watch or listen to that story or read it. Sorry, we're not watching it. Read the story in the Bible and just think, oh, that happened, 2,000 plus years ago. So it's not going to happen now. But this part is just to remind you that God is a God of patterns. Nothing really happens fully in isolation when it comes to God. And I will go into, in the next part, which is the last part of this episode, I will actually go into the 5 things that you need to remember. But this kind of helps build that foundation that God has patterns. God has a way of working the way that he's worked with people over the years, like way before you came into this world, way before your own bloodline even came into this world. So this incident was not a one-off. It was fantastic. It was such a display of God's power, but it really wasn't the only time that God showed his power. There were so many great people that God loved that came before Jehoshaphat. Remember, he's like 18 generations away from Abraham. So God has shown his power a lot in that time. And then, of course, all the way down to Jesus. And even after Jesus, he loves displaying his power for his people. And this is not a one-off incident. So I say all this to say that your own situation, compared to a lot of these situations, God has shown himself in much more extreme situations. So there is no reason why he wouldn't come through for you. He wants to come through for you. But sometimes knowledge is power. Like understanding how God has worked before really helps you put your own thing into perspective, because it is overwhelming. It is valid. It feels like the end of the road, but the God you serve is so powerful. He's done greater things. Like he could click a finger. There's a part in the Bible that says, I believe it's, oh gosh, I read a few Psalms every day, and I think it's Psalm 35, where, oh gosh, such an exciting Psalm actually, where David is talking about how like his enemies are after him. And actually, if you're going through anything that's kind of like gang stalking or harassment or people coming up against you, or just generally, people ganging up against you, it's a really good Psalm to read, because I hope I'm not wrong in saying this, but David actually talks about how God can just take a breath and they're gone. I think it says like even the air in your breath will just, there's some things that they're so small for God. Like that's what I'm trying to say. Some things are so small for God. When you're able to weigh your situation against what he's already done, you will realize that what he's already done. I mean, just think about parting the Red Sea. In fact, that's one of the examples I'm going to use. Moses and parting the Red Sea. This is the Exodus. This is bringing, if you listen to part 1 where I talk about the situation and kind of like the breakdown, the Israelites and from Abraham all the way. The Exodus is where God, through Moses, brings all of these people. They're over 1 million people. They're walking with their children, their men, their donkeys, their whatever they walk. They're all walking and they get to the Red Sea. They're in front of a whole ocean, baby girl. They don't know what to do, and God parts the sea. God tells them to stand still. In fact, this story is kind of similar to Jehoshaphat, where Moses tells them the same thing, like stand still and watch God deliver you. God comes and parts the sea. He parts the sea. Isn't that crazy? That's Exodus 14. There's Hezekiah as well in 2 Kings 19. 185,000 Assyrian soldiers surrounded Jerusalem. Hezekiah took the enemy's threatening letter. This one's amazing. Like this letter is kind of similar to the way Jehoshaphat prays. So he takes this letter before God. Imagine your enemies have threatened you. If you've gotten something like, I don't know, if you're in a legal case or something physical, from your enemies, right? You can take it to God, baby girl. And that could even just be, if you're in a financial situation, that could be your bank statement. Take it to God. Hezekiah spreads out this letter in front of God. Wait, he made it about God's honor. He's like, they are threatening you. He showed God the proof. These people are threatening you. It's not just about our survival. They wrote a letter. He brings evidence to God. He's like, they are threatening you. Anyway, that night, an angel literally just goes down and strikes the entire army. 185,000 people, kills them all. No fasting, no singing. This was just a prayer, sackcloth, and overnight superpower. That's how amazing God is. This God that you serve, don't forget him. There's a song that I really love. This song, it's called Remember. It's by a couple, Katie and Brian Talwat or something like that. I'll put the link in the show notes, or if you're watching on YouTube, I'll put it in the description. This song got me through one of the toughest times of my life. When I was on my knees, I was living in fear. I could not even raise my head up. And if you know me in real life, that is, gosh, like it was one of those times where I was just on my bathroom floor every morning and just saying to God, this is a threat to your kingdom. This is not even about, because, as far as I'm not important, is what I'm carrying, what you've put inside of me that's important. But I couldn't always pray that particular prayer. Sometimes I would be so spent that I couldn't even bring myself to speak before God. This song actually talks about, remember who you're talking to. Oh God, I wish I could sing it. Okay. Oh, my soul, remember who you're talking to, the only one who death bows to. That's the God who walks with you. Oh, I can't do it justice, okay? But the words of this song, the way that I held onto it, what I'm saying is it's so important to be able to look outside of your situation and remember the God that walks with you. This song led me to create this wallpaper on my phone, because sometimes your spirit knows it, but your mind every day is so overwhelmed by your situation, right? And I created this wallpaper on my phone. I took a picture. The sun was just setting over these tall buildings, in the city. And I took a picture and I made this wallpaper and I said, the entire army of the Most High God walks with you, baby girl. That's what I put on my screen. And it's still my screen paper to this day. The entire army of the Most High God. I had to remind myself, it's so easy to forget who God is. And you have to remind yourself, you have to remind yourself the battles that God has fought before. Because whatever you're going through right now, it's nothing. To him. To you it is. It's nothing to him. Anyway, there was Elijah as well. So we've talked about Moses. We've talked about Hezekiah. There was Elijah on Mount Carmel, 1 Kings 18. This was to do with when Elijah said a short prayer and literally fire fell from heaven immediately. And then he also prayed for rain to fall, but that took like 7 rounds. But God made it fall after 3.5 years of rain not falling. Like, there's just a way you can call on God. There really is. There's Esther and Haman. I talked a bit about that before. The decree. This is in Esther 3, chapter 3 to chapter 9. It's a really important story to know, especially if you're a woman, right? It's a really important story to know because the Bible doesn't talk a lot about women. But Esther, this single thing that she did, this single thing, laying her life down and trusting God, like really putting her trust in God. I mean, Esther literally said, if I perish, I perish. If I die, I die. I've prayed that prayer before. I've said to God, I am walking in faith. If I die, I die. You know, when you're walking with God, there is a death that happens. Even when you're alive, your flesh dies to the point where you're just like, my life is not even that important. And there was a point in my life where I gave everything to God except my life. And I knew that. I gave everything to God. I withdrew from a lot of things. I stopped doing a lot of things, okay? But I wasn't letting my life go. But the way that I live my life now, I'm dead. I'm dead. When you're so surrendered to God, you're like, your life is not even that important. If losing my life is part of your plan, I'm in. Esther was like, if I perish, I perish. She goes to the king. You're not supposed to turn up to the king if you're uninvited, even though you're a wife. And she goes to the king because her uncle reminds her that she was made for a time such as this. Oh, you need to read that. But God saves all of them. There was a decree to wipe out all of Israel and all of the Jews, and God saves them. There you go. And then the final one was Paul and Silas in prison. Not the final one, but my final example. Paul and Silas in prison, which is in the New Testament. So everything we've talked about is in the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, there's a perfect example of how God comes through. So Paul and Silas in Acts chapter 16, they get taken into prison and God calls for them. You know, God comes, the angel of the Lord comes in, but they do this through praise and worship. So this part was really just letting you know that the whole Jehoshaphat story is not in isolation. God has this track record of showing who he is. He really does. And he wants to. It's not even just you call him and he's like, Let me just answer this one. He wants to. He really wants to. He wants to show you who he is. But he can only show you who he is in those situations where there are no human explanations. So if you're at that point where you're like, there is no way I can pay this bill. There is no way this sickness, this diagnosis, there is just no way. It's already been diagnosed. This lawsuit or this breakup is choking. Like if you're at that point where you're just like, there is no way out. You are in the perfect spot. You are in the perfect spot for God to show you who he is, because first of all, he wants to win you over. He wants you to understand that there is a strength beyond yours, but he needs you to surrender, to yield. And then on top of that, he wants everybody else around you to know that this one, I've marked this one. God is so amazing. Oh, I get so excited, really. So God's power doesn't just work for one person. He can definitely do it for you. Let's head on over to the last part, which is part 5, where I talk about what this means for you and how to bring it all together in your present situation. So I talk specifically about 5 themes that you need to remember, 5 things that you need to remember in your situation right now. So part 5 is the final part of this episode, and it's actually where we bring everything together. So this is the part where we really try and figure out the 5 things that you need to remember in your situation. So far we've really talked a lot about Jehoshaphat and what God has done in other situations. Of course, we've talked about the prayer that you should pray in part 2, but more than anything, I really want you to hold on to these 5 things. So if you're in that situation right now that is just feeling really overwhelming, whatever that looks like for you, that medical diagnosis, the financial situation, the grief that you're going through, the loss that you're going through, people turning against you, whatever is feeling really overwhelming right now, here are 5 things that you should remember. If you didn't take anything else in that I've said, write these down. And remember, there will be a written post, so make sure you have a look in the description box if you're watching on YouTube, or if you're listening on the podcast platforms, then it will be in the show notes, okay? So I want you to remember these 5 things in your situation right now. Number 1, the method changes. It means that God is pretty creative with how he fights for you. It's the idea that the method changes. So when you look back at all the stories that we've talked about, obviously Jehoshaphat being the main one and Judah, but when you think about Esther and Haman, or Moses and the Red Sea, or Elijah and fire, like God has used different ways to fight people's battles for them. He's used fire, he's used earthquake, he's sent angels to fight battles, he has caused confusion and panic, like with the story that we've been talking about in 2 Chronicles 20, because that's really how he fought their battle. God has always used different ways. He's pretty creative. You know, we are made in his own image. In the same way that we are creative, God himself is creative. So it's important to bear that in mind, so that when you're praying, you're not actually just telling God what to do. So remember the end of Jehoshaphat's prayer, which we talked about in part 2, which was, but my eyes are on you, or but our eyes are on you. He didn't tell God what to do. He didn't say go and confuse them. In fact, in those situations, it's very difficult to know what to do. If you're genuinely in a situation where you just don't really know how this is going to happen, you're not really in a place to be telling God what to do. But as human beings, we really want to just say, God, kill my enemies. God, do this. No, leave it to God. God has his way of doing it. His ways are higher than our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. So just remember that, number 1, in your situation right now, remember that God is very creative. You may not know what he's going. In fact, you're not going to know what he's going to do. You're not going to know how he's going to do it. Your only job is to keep your eyes on him and have faith and take action. Stand still, by the way, is also taking action, but just have faith. Don't try and figure out how. That's not really your business. Let God do it, by fire, by earthquake, by parting the Red Sea. Whatever he wants to do, let him do it. Because remember, the battle is not yours. This is not just a battle of right now. This is a battle, an ancient battle. We go back as far as Abraham. So whatever is threatening you right now is also threatening God, and God's promises are at stake. So he knows the best way to fight this battle. That is the first thing to remember. He's creative. Don't tell him what to do. Just tell him that you trust him and let him show up for you. Number 2, the second thing I want you to remember in your situation right now is that surrender is not defeat. Surrender is strategy. It's very important for you to remember this, because sometimes we feel like when we say we cannot do things out loud, sometimes we're even ashamed to go to God. God is okay with that, by the way. Like, he's not judging you for not being able to do it. He made you that way. He intentionally made you to be dependent on him in certain situations. He designed it that way. So don't be afraid to say, and even if it means saying it in front of other people, because remember, Jehoshaphat said this in front of all the people that he's supposed to be their king. Don't be afraid to surrender to God out loud, whatever that looks like, because even when you surrender in the secret, to everybody else, it's obvious. You know, there's certain situations where like people are trying to come at you and they're trying to trigger you. If you're a person that is surrendered to God, you're going to look to them. Why are they not fighting back? Why are they not being triggered? Why are they just kind of like getting on with life? Because the battle is God's. Surrender is strategy. It is strategy. It's kind of like silence. It's also a strategy. When God fights for you, your only strategy is to be surrendered and silent, to stand still. Psalm 46 verse 10, be still and know that I am God. God understands this language. This surrender language, God gets it. He designed it so that he can fight for you. You don't have to fight every battle. If you want God to fight for you, surrender is not weakness. Silence is not weakness. It is actually strategy. In reality, you can't do it yourself anyway. Remember what Esther said when she was going in to see the king, her husband, uninvited. She said, if I perish, I perish. That is surrender. Jehoshaphat also saying, we cannot do this ourselves. That is surrender. We don't know what to do. That is surrender. When Moses said, stand still, watch God fight for you. Again, surrender. So just remember, it's a strategy and God understands it. And that's all that matters. It doesn't matter what it looks like to the eyes of other people. God created that entire strategy. And you can see it play in all of these stories and many others that I haven't mentioned. The third thing I want you to remember in your situation right now is that God really does move when his honor is at stake. At that point where you present it to God as though it's not just about me, it's really about you and what you are protecting in me, you have to understand that that is a pressure point for God. That is, I'm not that he goes through pressure, but he wants you to say those things to him, because when you look back at these themes, that is when God really, really does move. Remember Hezekiah? He framed the whole thing. He brought the letter that the enemies wrote. He brought it to God and he was like, look at this threat. Look at this threat. And then the same with Jehoshaphat. He was literally saying to God, you are the God of our ancestors. You are the one who promised us this land. And then you are the one who gave us this land. And then now these guys, they're coming to try and kill us and take this land away from us. They made it about God. It's about God's honor. It's about God's name. There is a way that you can frame it and make it about God. And he moves then, because it's not that he's not going to move anyway, because you have to remember that he knows what you're going to pray to him even before you pray. In fact, he knows you, he made you, he called you by name, he knows all of that, but he wants you to act it out. He wants you to act it out because you have free will. He wants you to take that step of faith. He wants you to remind him who he is. He wants you to let him know that he made all these promises to Abraham and you are part of these promises. And not just that, there is work that he's doing in your life. You're here for a reason. So whatever he's doing in your life, any situation that's threatening you is threatening the work that he's doing in your life, the work that he's called you to do. And even if you don't know what that is, it's still a threat to his work, because you can't figure it out if your brain is all thinking about finances and maybe you're homeless right now, or whatever the situation is, you're going through a breakup or you don't have a job. Like, you can't even figure out God's plan for you with all that chaos. So it is still a threat whether or not you know his plan, because you know that he does have plans. Jeremiah 29:11, I know the plans I have towards you. They're of good and not of evil, to bring you a future and an expected end. An expected end. God has a future for you. So even if you don't know that plan right now, tell him that you can't figure out the plan because this is a threat, this issue you're facing. And if you know the plan, even better, tell him, I can't do this thing that you've called me to do because this is threatening your plan. And once you tell God that his honor is at stake and you frame it that way, watch him move. Watch him move. The fourth thing I want you to remember in your heavy season right now, the season that's feeling really overwhelming and you just feel like, oh, I just can't do it anymore. The fourth thing I want you to remember is that you need to worship before the breakthrough. I know it sounds a bit like, why would I? Now hear me. Worship, and I really hope you've got this far. Worship is an act of war. Not just an act of faith. Worship is an act of war. When I'm telling you that worshiping God in praise and in joy and as if the thing that you're asking for is done before it's done, you are fighting war. You are fighting a battle. A lot of us don't realize that the things that make us feel really overwhelmed, they're spiritual warfare. You don't realize what's at stake because you don't fully understand who you are in Christ. You don't understand the bloodline you've come from. You don't understand the promises that God has made to the people before you. Because remember, we're reading the Bible because it's written. A lot of our ancestors didn't leave notes for us, but God told them things about us. Before God made people great, he predicted it. Before he chose David. I don't want to go off on a tangent, but God is so intentional and I just have this passion about passing it over. So let me just make this point. Before God even put David on the throne, he rejected Saul 10 years before David was born. And he said to Samuel, I'm going to bring a man after my own heart. He rejected Saul as king and he said he was bringing someone, a man after his own heart. And David came from the same line as Jacob, because remember, Saul was like, he was a king that was chosen by the people. They were so tired of God being their king. They wanted a king. So God just gave them Saul. But God didn't have the person that he wanted to be his king. Before David was even born, God had already chosen him. So we're reading the scripture about David, about like, oh, God went to Jesse's house through Samuel and he was looking for who to choose. God already made that choice. Same with Esau and Jacob. Before they even were born, God already told Rebekah, the mother, God said to Rebekah, the older will serve the younger. God already chose Israel before Israel was even Israel. His name was even Jacob when he was born. And then God changed his name. Before Isaac came, the father of Esau and Jacob, God told Abraham, I'm going to bring my own child into this world through you when he was 100. Listen, God has already chosen you before you got here. He already chose you. You just don't know it. And of course you don't. You're not even supposed to. It's not supposed to overwhelm you. That's because God has a plan for you. He's made it so that whether you know or not, he's put resources in place. He's put systems in place where you can ask him a certain way and he will answer you. Where people will remind you, like maybe you've come across this podcast today. People will just stir up something in your spirit. That's God reminding you who you are. I digress. I'm talking here about worshiping before the breakthrough, okay? Worship like it's already done before it's done. Going back to the whole thing about Jehoshaphat, the whole worship theme, you can see it all along. As soon as God answers his prayer, which is practically immediately, they start worshiping, but that's before God has already won the war. And also, God never told them how he was going to do it. So they didn't even know at the time how he was going to do it. So they worshipped him then. The next day, he sent all these musicians to go out and sing on a battlefield. Can you imagine? They're worshiping God the whole time. They're praising God the whole time. Sends them over. God wins the war. They come back to worshiping God after they've taken. This whole thing of worship is spiritual warfare. And you have to worship like it's already done. Let me tell you something. It will never make sense to your mind, but there is a point where whilst you are worshiping, your spirit just gets so aligned with the Spirit of God. Because remember, we have the Holy Spirit inside of us, right? And the Holy Spirit's job is to align our spirits with the Spirit of God. His job is to link us to God. There is a point where you're deep in that worship and he takes over. Your spirit takes over and you'll never understand what's happened. There are no words for it. Anyway, worship before the breakthrough. Believe you and me when I say it is an act of warfare and it's also an act of faith. And God doesn't take that very lightly, because when you look at a lot of the stories in the Bible, Jehoshaphat we've talked about, but Paul and Silas, they were just praising God in the prison and then God showed up. God really enjoys worship. There's a way you can call God down with your worship that you will never understand, just your spirit knows, because your spirit remembers everything. But it's so suppressed by everything that's happening in our world. So that worship really takes you into your spirit. And then before you know it, you're in tune with God. You start getting downloads. God starts telling you things. He starts making you feel at ease. He removes your fear. There's so much God can do through worship. It is such an act of warfare. So that's the fourth thing I need you to remember. Worship before it's done, like it's done. The final thing, the fifth thing I want you to remember in your situation right now is that God doesn't break his promises. Again, if you listen to part 1 where I talked about, the lineage from Abraham all the way to Jehoshaphat and that being 18 generations, what I may not have said is that those 18 generations equated to around 1,100 years, give or take. Let's call it 1,000 years. In that mix was David, right? So from Abraham, the promise that was made to Abraham, God actually fulfilled it in generation 14 during David's time. So Abraham in his lifetime never even got to see the promised land. He didn't get to see any of the things that God promised, but he held faith. So he was holding that faith in his generation, but over time, God made it happen. Got to David's generation and David secured all of that land that God had promised. But God also made David promises. God made David promises that he will keep his throne. His throne will endure forever because David was the second king. He was the one who took over Saul, who was the first king of Israel. God said to David that his throne will endure. God does keep his promises. And then fast forward to Jehoshaphat, who is like 5 generations after David, going through this war right now, probably not even knowing what God actually said to David, but he's going through this war, this life or death situation, and then God comes through. So this point is really just letting you know that God will keep his promise, whether you're aware of it or not. He already knows what you're going to do, like I said, but he will keep his promise. That is the God that he is. And remember, you are part of Abraham's promises. We all are. We're part of Abraham's promises. So even if you don't know any promise that God has made to your family, your bloodline, just tap into Abraham's. Tap into everything that the Bible says, all the promises that God is, tap into that. And mind you, the whole thing about David's throne was how Jesus came, because Jesus is the king. And that's how Jesus came. And we are now part of that. Because of Jesus, we're all part of that. So tap into that because God does keep his promises. Okay, so just to summarize this part, the 5 things that you must remember. Number 1 is that God is creative. He will decide how he wins the battle for you. You don't need to tell him. He does it in different ways, but all you need to do is trust that he will. Number 2, surrender is not defeat. It's a strategy. So you go to God, be all surrendered, trust him. And even if in the eyes of the world, you look like, why is she not being triggered? Why is she not fighting? Why is she not doing any of this? Trust me, it's a strategy. Stay silent, keep your eyes on God, stay surrendered, which by the way means like you are telling God, I cannot do this. Like it's not even just I'm surrendered as a strategy. It's like I'm admitting I have no strength. Number 3, God moves when his honor is at stake. How you present the situation to God is really important because you have to remind him that his name is at stake here, or his plan for you, his plan through you, because you are a vessel. Me on my own, I'm not important, but the plan you have for me, for the world, through me, that's being threatened. If I die, I just can't do it. That kind of stuff. He will move on your behalf. Number 4 is worshiping before the breakthrough and remembering how it is an act of warfare. It's not just worshiping for faith. And faith, the actual act of faith is super important because you're telling God, I already know that you've done this and I trust it. And I'm thanking you, the whole gratitude thing. It's like, no, I'm thanking you for doing it. But also it's an act of warfare. It's an absolute act of warfare. So many stories of how worship, just the walls of Jericho fell down flat as they were worshiping God. Paul and Silas, all of it. Number 4 is worship before the breakthrough. And then number 5 is remember that God keeps his promises from generation to generation. Whether or not you're aware of the promises, God himself is, and he will keep it. The situation might seem really overwhelming for you right now, but God is aware of how that's come about. So he will keep his promises, but you have free will and he needs you to tap into that trust that he knows that you have for him. And if you've watched this far, then I know that you definitely trust God. So just tap into it. Let him do what he does best, which is be the God that is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Like he always keeps his promises. He's not a man that he should lie. There is nothing beyond his strength and his ability and his might. He will do the things he said he will do. And that's just God for you. He's not going to change. Certainly not because of your situation. It's not that overwhelming for him. Those are all the 5 parts of today's episode, but what I'm going to do is just quickly talk about what would have been part 6, which is actually now going to be more in detail in the written post. So remember, I've been talking about a written post. I will leave the link in the show notes. And if you're watching on YouTube, then I will leave it in the description. Part 6, I'm just going to briefly tell you what it's about. So it has a few things in it. For example, when the pattern breaks. So remember this episode, we're talking about when God fights for you. Now, there are times that God himself needs you to be the one to take the action. It's not just that he's going to come and fight for you, which we now know he can absolutely do, but he does need you to take the action. So remember, as much as God loved David, God chose David, God actually, when he came to David and Goliath, God needed David to show up at that battlefield and be the one to sling the thing, the stone, and kill the giant in front of people. There are times when God wants you to be the one doing it. He needs you to be the one showing up. And then other things like there are times when even when God can fight the battle for you, he may not necessarily do because there's certain things blocking him. For example, your sin might be blocking him. So if you're someone who's trying to understand why God hasn't answered, it may actually just be that he wants to, but your sin is in the way. Again, I'm not going to go through all of that. I'm going to write it all down. Other things like human credit, if it really looks like, okay, this situation could be explained by a human being has done it, God may not necessarily step in. But I'm also going to put in a lot about Jehoshaphat's lineage. So if you're interested in knowing about the lineage, like how Jehoshaphat links to Abraham, I mean, if I was listening to this, I would be so interested in that because it's the only way that I'll be able to understand fully how God himself, not that we can understand how he thinks, but how God intentionally makes plans from generations to generations. And you as a human being in this generation, considering all of your great grandfathers are dead, you're not really going to understand that plan fully, but it gives you an insight into the mind of God, and it helps you really kind of pull from that about how your situation, first of all, is just nothing compared to what God has already shown that he can do. But more importantly, you are pulling from, you're still part of that lineage, you're still part of the promises of Abraham, you're still part of all of that. So I'm gonna put all that in there. And this one might be really useful anyway for everyone who's listened. So if you're a visual person and you want to understand, you want to see the prayer structure in a table, Jehoshaphat's prayer structure, everything I've talked about today in part 2, if you want to see that in a table because you're a visual person, I've got a table for you that actually tells you what Jehoshaphat prayed, what you can say, so your version of that prayer, which would be like something that you can do today. And then another table that I have for you, which is actually really interesting, is one of how God has worked in other people. So, like in part 4, where we were talking about how God has not just done this one thing with Jehoshaphat and has never done it before. What I really like about the way I've put this table together is it's the way that I would love to see it, which is, okay, what did Jehoshaphat do except for the prayer? So first of all, did he fast? Yes, he did. Did he sing? Yes, he did. Did he have to fight? No, he didn't. How quickly did the answer happen? Straight away / overnight. And then also how God moved so the enemies turned against each other. And then I do that for Jehoshaphat. I do that for Moses, for Hezekiah, for Elijah, for Joshua and Jericho, for Esther, for Paul and Silas, and Daniel even. So like you're able to kind of see in one table how all these different characters in the Bible, what they did, how God answered quickly. And beyond everything that I've said, you can create your own theme from that. You can actually say, okay, if somehow God is pulling me towards the story of Esther, maybe he does want me to do that 3-day fast. Or if he's pulling me towards the story of Jehoshaphat, maybe he wants me to pray this prayer with this theme. Let the Spirit of God minister to you. And at the very least, like just have it as knowledge. Have an understanding of what people before you have done, how they have called on the power of God to come and how quickly he has come. And God is able to reveal to you why that is. I know that certainly in the process of going through this, I didn't stumble upon this just like that. I was actually, and I should have said this at the beginning, but I intentionally didn't want to make it about me. I was going through a really tough time and there was a day that I was just crying. I'm totally surrendered to God, but as human beings, sometimes when you're just like, oh, it's a lot, God, but I've still got my eyes on you. And honestly, that was what I kept on saying to myself. I kept on reminding myself, of what God has done in my life so far. I was crying and I was just saying, but you've done this before. In fact, what was actually happening was I was saying out loud what I would say to a younger version of myself. I had this thought that if this was the younger version of you and you saw her crying and you have achieved all the things that God has called you to achieve, what would you tell her? So I was crying as I was giving my younger self the advice. And I was saying things like, I will tell her to wait. I will tell her that God has done this before. I will tell her that God has done this for other people before. I will tell her to remember that God showed up for me when, and I gave examples. And I was still crying because I was sad, and I'm still this version of me. Right after that, I got on my knees and I just prayed, and I just said, God, I still trust you, but it is heavy. It is heavy on my heart. It's heavy on my shoulders. And it was in that process that God actually led me to 2 Chronicles 20. And I spent almost a day. It was like an overnight thing. I read it the night before and my mind was blown. I've read it before, but I didn't understand it like I've explained it to you, hence the long podcast. And the next day I just spent hours just on it. And I was just in this thing with God. And then suddenly I realized that I had to share it, that it wasn't just for me. I'm not sharing all of this with you because you're the one in that situation. There's been times where I've been, and this was God's way of comforting me. This was God's way of reminding me what he's done for other people. So I say all that to say that it's really helpful to be able to look at a table and see what God has done for other people, but also through that, God might speak to you in the way that he needs to speak to you for your own situation. So I encourage you to have a look at the link in the show notes to the written version. But yeah, I really, really hope that this episode has been useful, and I have prayed and I've said to God that I hope that it finds the woman that needs to hear this at the right time. I just want to let you know that God does love you, and maybe I went through all the things I went through so he could put me through this entire scripture just so I could share it with you, for you. You never know. He's that intentional. He really is that intentional. I'm rooting for you, and the God you serve, remember that song? The God you serve is pretty big. He's no joke. He certainly doesn't play about you. And the reason why you're still here, I remember my dad telling me this, I'll share this somewhere else, but the reason why you're still here is because there is a God reason. Everything you've been through, if this episode is for you, then you know that everything you've been through should have broken you. And this one thing that you're going through in isolation, considering your strength, you're probably, you would have been fine, but it's on top of everything else. It's the straw that breaks the camel's back. It in itself is overwhelming, but God has got your back. He really does. And he just needs you to keep your eyes on him. We're going to end this episode here. God help me with the editing. I will see you in the next episode. But before I leave you, I'm just going to say, if there are any situations that you want to share, please feel free to share in the comments, okay? I would love to hear how you're dealing with things, how you're navigating life, if any of this has resonated with you as well. I'll see you in the next episode.